Hi everyone, I'm Neama Rahmani, real lawyer and former prosecutor, giving you a recap of the Lori Vallow trial. This case was one of the saddest and most gruesome in recent history, particularly in the state of Idaho, where Lori Vallow and her husband Chad Daybell were accused of murdering Lori's 2 children and burying them in their backyard. JJ and Tylee were found in a shallow grave months after they were missing, and the entire nation was tracking this case because even though they were missing, Lori and Chad were acting like nothing happened. They were vacationing in Hawaii. The 2 of them were linked to a cult in Idaho, and they believed that the world was coming to an end in 2020. The children, of course, disappeared in 2019, and it took 3 years for the case to finally come to trial. And it was an interesting case because Chad Daybell wanted the case severed, which means separated from Lori Vallow. He did not want to be tried with her. And interestingly, it's probably going to end up worse for him. Now, even though Lori was convicted, and we're going to talk about how that happened, she actually won the case before it even started. And that's because her lawyers were able to convince the judge to take the death penalty off the table. And the reason that happened was because Idaho state prosecutors didn't comply with their discovery obligations. That means they didn't turn over the evidence in a timely manner. And as a result, the judge said prosecutors can't pursue the death penalty. So the maximum Lori was facing was life in prison. So she decided to roll the dice and take her case to trial. The case involved 3 murders, actually, the 2 children and Chad's ex-wife, Tammy Daybell. And the charges were 2 sets, the substantive murder counts, but also importantly, conspiracy to commit murder, because the state didn't know who actually committed the murders. So what they wanted the jurors to believe is that Lori Vallow agreed to commit the murders, and there was an overt act or an action in furtherance of that unlawful agreement or conspiracy, because it was difficult for the state to pin down exactly who killed the kids. From the outset, it was clear that the state was going to focus on 3 themes: sex, money, and power. Chad and Lori had this very strange sexual relationship, and they would talk about their different fantasies over the phone and text message. And it was clear that even though they didn't say they wanted to get rid of the kids, that they thought that the kids were possessed or they were demons, that somehow that they would have a different or a better life if the kids weren't around. And of course, the power is this cult mentality where Chad Daybell had written books about the afterlife and the apocalypse, and he had a few people actually join this cult of his. So the prosecution said, the reason that Lori and Chad killed their children is because of some weird religious belief, but also because it fulfilled some deviant sexual fantasy. Because one question the jurors had was, why would anyone do this to their own children? Why would anyone act like this? And there really hasn't been a case like this since Casey Anthony many years ago, where there was a missing child and the parent, in this case, both parents, were acting in a really strange way, not reporting their children missing for months, acting like everything was okay. So prosecutors needed some sort of explanation. So they really spent time talking about the religion and talking about the sexual fantasies, but also the money. The money was very important in the case. After the children died, Lori continued to receive benefits from the government, even after they were dead, because her son was special needs. But importantly, the state did a good job of showing the financial motive for Chad and Lori to kill Chad's ex-wife, Tammy. Chad went from having the bare minimum life insurance from his wife to maxing it out months before her death. And he actually went to collect that life insurance just a couple days after she was found killed. So the state put forth a very strong case, and the evidence of the murder was horrific. Their son was asphyxiated, he had duct tape over his mouth, and one of the key pieces of evidence was Lori's hair was on that duct tape. So that was the key evidence that tied her to the murders. This wasn't a hair on his clothing or somewhere else. It was actually on the duct tape that was used to kill him and to strangle him. The daughter was dismembered, her body was burned, and of course, as I mentioned, they're both buried in these really shallow graves. The other really key piece of evidence was Chad and Lori's reactions after the murder. So they were taken into custody first because they violated a court order having to tell the court where the kids were. They basically abandoned their kids, and neglect was the first set of charges. And while they were in custody, Lori's family members would call, and these jail recordings, they're all recorded. Lori's son would question her, where are my siblings? And her response was, she had no affect, she showed no emotion, and she was essentially being cross-examined by her family members and her friends. Hey, where are the kids? And she didn't react in a way that a loving mother would. So between the forensic evidence, the financial motive, and no real clear explanation, the state put on a very strong case. Adding the financial motive, it was going to be a very tough case for Lori's lawyers to defend. Now, before the case started, Lori was temporarily deemed incompetent to stand trial, which means that she was unable to assist her lawyers in her defense, and she was acting erratically. She called the Mormon church from jail, asked to speak to one of the lawyers there. So we didn't know if she would be declared competent and whether she would try to pursue some sort of insanity defense. Now, Idaho famously does not have an insanity defense, but even though it doesn't have an insanity defense, that doesn't mean prosecutors don't have to prove criminal intent, that guilty mind for murder. And there was a possibility that prosecutors would go in that, the defense would go in that direction and say, Lori was acting at the direction of Chad. She was under his influence. It was some sort of religious sacrifice or something. Essentially just blame Chad. That would have been the easy thing to do. That would be what was expected from most defendants, right? When there's a murder and prosecutors don't know who did it, most of the time defendants will point the finger at a co-defendant, the empty chair. But that's not what happened in this case. Either because Lori didn't want to, because she was afraid of Chad, or more likely because she was in love with Chad, she did not blame her husband. The person she did blame was her brother, Alex Cox, who may have been involved in the murders, but who also was found dead. A lot of folks in his family that were killed. She ended up trying to blame her brother, and that's something that came out during opening statement. So the prosecution put on weeks of testimony. I think they put on 59 or 60 witnesses. But interestingly, when it was Lori's turn to put on witnesses, to put on a defense, she did nothing. Her defense didn't put up a single witness. Lori, of course, didn't take the stand. And then it was clear that she was going to be convicted. During closing arguments, the defense again tried to point the finger at the brother, Alex Cox, kind of started to point the finger at Chad Daybell, and you saw Lori's reaction. She was not happy with that. But it didn't take the jurors much time. The closings finished on a Thursday, and I predicted that the jury would come back with a quick guilty verdict the following day on Friday. And that's exactly what happened. They found Lori Vallow guilty on all counts. She's likely going to spend the rest of her life in prison, but she will not be executed. Chad Daybell's trial is going to happen next year, 2024, and for him, the death penalty is still on the table. That's going to be a very difficult case for him to defend because everyone in Idaho and around the country knows that Lori Vallow was convicted of murder. So there's going to be even more pressure on the jurors to return a guilty verdict for Chad, who's even less sympathetic. Men tend to do worse than women when it comes to these murder trials. Not only that, Chad is also facing the death penalty. So when you have these subsequent trials, the prosecution tends to have the benefit because their witnesses are going to be more prepared. They're not going to be surprised during cross-examination because they've been through it once already. And of course, whenever you're dealing with a death penalty case, death penalty qualified jurors are more likely to return a guilty verdict. So even though his trial hasn't started yet, I think it's likely that Chad Daybell will also be convicted. And the real question will be, does he get the death penalty, unlike Lori Vallow? Thanks everyone for watching my post-mortem of the Lori Vallow case. Like, follow, subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications.